Hi guys, welcome back to another book review of The Last Heart Beating. This is a continuation of part one. We are into a different section now. I believe this is our fourth or fifth section now. There's 7 sections altogether in part one. This section is called The Good 80s, and this is where we learn a little bit of Natalia's childhood, how her dad would show up to her school to talk about his job, and how all the other kids were mesmerized by it. She essentially goes on to talk about how they lived in Florida at that time, and they would have lots of different wrestlers over, the Iron Sheik, for example, and that her dad would hang out with them. Randy Savage was also over a lot, so Miss Elizabeth came over to hang out with her mother. Her dad only had like a day off, maybe a month, which is really extreme to, us regular folk. But if you weren't on the road, you weren't making money back then. So essentially, they had to be on the road a lot. And this is where the good times kind of go into the bad a little bit because you get banged up and beat up a lot. And a lot of wrestlers didn't know how to handle that, so they would take different drugs and other things. Her dad was on cocaine. It eventually caught up to him where they kind of figured out, even as young kids, that something was off about their dad, and he would snap, and he wasn't the same fun, happy go lucky dad that he always had been, and that they were actually looking forward to dropping him off at the airport for work, which is kind of sad, really. I mean, you'd hate to see the deterioration of any type of family, but this is what the section, the good 80s, was about. This part was called the bad 90s, and it's an extension on to the good 80s, but obviously worse. Natty explains how her dad's substance abuse got out of control to the point that he was not showing up for wrestling events. And if you don't show up, you're eventually going to get fired, which is what had happened. They had their car repossessed. They had been living off scraps. They had to go to food banks. So they were rock bottom pretty much. And at the end of this part, it pretty much explains how Natty's mom was thinking about packing all the kids up and moving back to Calgary. They also went on to teach us about how the CTE scans in the brain, how that affected a lot of Natty's dad's behaviors, and how when he was a young boy, he would play football a lot, and back then they did not use helmets. They would just push through injuries, and he had gotten concussed a lot to the point that by the time that he was in his 30s, his brain was more like an older person's brain. And by the time that he died in his 60s, it was like an even older brain, and he was living with onset Alzheimer's. It's good to know for now, but back then in the 90s, that wasn't something that was talked about. It wasn't something that was commonly known. But now they know, and as more research goes on, this is why we have things like helmets and other things in different athletics. And I kind of enjoyed this part. I found that it was really informative. And let me know what you guys think. In this part, it's called Back to Canada. And Natty describes how her mother and her sisters left Florida, and unfortunately, her dad behind. Her house got repossessed, as was talked about in the last chapter. Her family lost everything, and her father did not want to face her grandfather, so her mother and her sisters went back to Calgary and lived in the Hart family home. She had cousins, Matt, Harry, There was other cousins. One of their friends, TJ, which later becomes, as we know, Natty's husband, is also there as well, and they all do kids wrestling association. So her grandfather has this huge ring in his front yard, and all the kids like to wrestle on it and make their own moves and such. And anyways, one day that ring was empty. And we come to find out why, because her cousin Matt picked up a very rare and very deadly form of strep. It was strep A. And unfortunately, he ends up passing away from this, which is devastating to the family. Owen Hart, who began to be a big time WWE star, he didn't want the family to worry about anything, so he paid for the funeral and he paid for his parents to go, Matt's parents, that is, which would be like a relative of his, and he paid for their vacation afterwards to go to Hawaii and just to take their minds off of everything that happened. It's so sweet of Owen, but such a devastating loss for their family. Natty and her mom and her sisters just stick together, and Natty goes on to explain how she wants to become a wrestler. Her grampy is a little bit worried since women aren't really in the rough and tumble business of wrestling. It's mostly a male predominant sport, but she has her mind set on things. She also helped out in the kids wrestling with being a ring announcer and a bell keeper and just little roles like that. But she mostly wants and craves independence so that she'll never feel like hand to food, paycheck to paycheck type deal, that she can ultimately depend on herself and that she won't ever be in a spot where she will be that poor or not have anything again. So the next and last section is called That Little Shit. And it pretty much is a little bit of a summary of how Natalia and TJ, her future husband, pretty much her opinion of him way before she was even interested in him. She goes on to say how he was a nice guy, very quiet, just really liked wrestling and stuff, and how after her cousin Matt died, he started hanging out with Ted a lot more, which was Matt's older brother. They became inseparable because they bonded over the trauma of losing her cousin Matt, and he was around the family a lot. They kind of took TJ in because his family was not doing too well. He lived with his mom in a women's shelter, and they just kind of took on that role for him and let him stay with them. And he essentially became part of the family. I think it's great, a loving and kind family she has, and what a loving and kind family the Hart family is overall. She also goes on to tell us that her dad cleaned up his act and eventually got back into wrestling, where him and her uncle Brett went over to WCW. She gives us a little bit of a rundown of the Montreal screw job and how that actually caused some turmoil in her family because of how Vince screwed over Brett. This was the last section in this part one. Let me know what you guys think so far. The next video I'll go on to do part 2, and I will probably do a rundown through half of it and then do the other half in another video. How are you guys liking this book review so far? Are you enjoying it? Are you reading the book too? I would love to hear your thoughts. Thank you so much for tuning in, and I'll see you in another book review. Bye guys.